You're in the Treloar Technology Annex. We refer to this building as Treloar E. John Treloar was the first director of the Australian War Memorial, and it signifies our connection back to the work of the Australian War Records section on the Western Front, which commenced in 1917. As you can see in this building, we hold the bulk of our aeroplane collection, some of it which is here only temporary before it goes back on display at our new facilities in Campbell, and some of it will be here for a little longer. Welcome to the event today, which really marks the end of a very long story, which the people who follow me are more than able to tell the details. But the recovery and restoration of the OV-10A Bronco 639. Can I just acknowledge some of our guests who are here with us today? I won't go through the two sides of this, so you'll be relieved to hear that, but there are some people who need to be acknowledged. Firstly, Air Marshal Rob Chipman, Chief of Air Force, Rear Admiral Brett Wolski, Air Commodore Dave Patterson, Commander Combat Support Group, Air Commodore Peter Robertson, Commander Air Combat Group, Rear Admiral Lee Goddard, and I also noticed Ian Pearson, who was here with us today. Thanks, Ian, who's been a great supporter of the memorial in a number of different ways. Can I also acknowledge our overseas diplomatic guests, Major Jake Krebs from the United States Marine Attaché. Marine Corps is still part of the US Defence Organisation, but welcome, Jake. And Wing Commander Rebecca Maynard from the New Zealand Defence Force. Welcome, Rebecca. We do have a very long and distinguished list from the Forward Air Control family, and I will only mention two. Rank does have its privileges: Air Marshal Doug Riding and Mr. William Roberts, the National President of Vietnam Veterans Federation. But I welcome all the Forward Air Controllers, those who flew in Vietnam with the United States Air Force, and also their partners who have been with them along the journey. Can I welcome also international guests, Mr. Jim Hodgson, Executive Director, Fort Worth Aviation Museum, United States, and Fort Worth plays a very important role in this story. Mr. Thomas Kemp, also from the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, Mr. Roger Dodd, and Margaret Haken from the United States, and Mr. Sylvester Klenoga and Mrs. Klenoga, and you'll forgive my pronunciation. Can I welcome also from the Air Force History and Heritage Organisation, Group Captain Pete Norford and Jane, and also Mr. Andrew Bishop, Chief Engineer of the Temora Aviation Museum. I'll introduce Matt Anderson shortly, but a couple of members of staff of the memorial who have been part of this very long story. Mark Whitmore, who was a former Assistant Director, National Collection, Nick Fletcher, who heads up our military heraldry and technology part of the organisation in a curatorial sense, Mel Cohen, who heads up the collection services, and the team that actually did the hands-on work on this aeroplane, Ainsley Greiner, Kim Wood, Jamie Croker, Dean Willis and Mart Aitken, who make up our large technology object workshop. It would be remiss of me not to mention two people who aren't here today, but who were critical in this aircraft being restored to its current status. Tim Sullivan, my predecessor as Assistant Director, National Collection, and also Laura Kennedy, who steered what was a very complicated course through a major restoration which involved trips overseas to Belgium and the United States, the recovery of major parts of the aircraft that we needed to do a complete restoration, and without Tim and Laura's efforts we wouldn't be here today. That's all from me for a bit. Can I welcome Matt Anderson, the Director of the Australian War Memorial? Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Brian. Can I start by acknowledging our traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as we do every night at the Australian War Memorial, I want to honour those of you who have served, those of you that are still serving, and particularly today, the families who love and support you. He's not here at the moment, but one of the longest serving directors of the Australian War Memorial was Major General Steve Gower, who used to say publicly that a great museum required a great collection, and this one was incomplete. Certainly, we couldn't tell the story of Australia's war in Vietnam without telling the story of the forward air controllers. And we couldn't tell their story without one of the aircraft they flew, be that the Bird Dog, the Skymaster, or the Bronco. So, in 1998, 25 years ago, the memorial started the process that led us to today. Success has many fathers, and I'm the bloke who gets to stand here today and claim credit for all of the work that was done before I even got here. The memorial's volunteer, ex-RAFI Alan Storr, and the then Senior Curator for Military Technology, John White, who sought contact with many of you who had served in Vietnam for your logbooks and the details of the sorties that you'd flown. But how this particular aircraft came to be here today rests heavily on the shoulders of two men, Ken Semler and Kim Wood, both of whom will speak today. It also involves the Royal Australian Navy, HMAS Tobruk, and Brett, who was the commanding officer of HMAS Tobruk when this aircraft came home. The Departments of Defence and the Departments of Foreign Affairs and Trade, our embassies in Washington and in Manila, the Departments of State, and of course the US Embassy here in Canberra, and the Fort Worth Aviation Museum. This wouldn't be here without people across those organisations. But of course the aircraft is also storied in its own right, and it's unique amongst our collection, for it's the only aircraft in the collection that has seen service in the United States Air Force. Now, I say that, don't be confused by that Sabre that's behind there marked up as a US Air Force aircraft. That briefly entered the hands of a collector in the US, and it very much flew with the Royal Australian Air Force in both numbers 3 squadrons, 77 Squadron and 79 Squadron. So it's one of ours. But my job today is simply to welcome you to the Treloar Centre, as Brian's mentioned, Treloar E to be precise. But today and in this company, there is something I want to place on record. As Peter Condon and Chris Clark wrote in this book, Hit My Smoke, and I quote, "Despite the extraordinarily active part that the FACS played in operations in Vietnam over 5.5 years, comparatively little has been heard about their contribution in the Australian public. The popular image of this nation's Vietnam conflict remained dominated by the activities of the army elements in Phuoc Tuy. It scarcely mattered that no group, with the possible exception of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, saw more action on a consistent and almost daily basis and across the length and breadth of the now defunct Republic than did the forward air controllers. Reflecting the high risks of their role, the FACS also emerged from the Vietnam conflict as one of the most highly decorated groups of Australians sent to that war. No fewer than 23 members were recognised under the Imperial Honours and Awards system. 2 were appointed Companions of the Distinguished Service Order. 15 received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and 6 were mentioned in dispatches. There's a page in this book, Hit My Spoke, devoted just to the foreign awards that they also earned. And so, to the pioneers, and to the 9 batches, as I'm told you are called, of FACS who followed, and with call signs as colourful as Jade and as Ascot, Bart, Issue, Tamale, Sidewinder, Drama, Thirsty, Rod, Nile, Slugger, Rash, Helix and Bilk. Here is your story at the Australian War Memorial. Here it is in the heart of the land you loved, and here those of us that work here will guard so preciously the record that you yourselves have made. You honour us by being here today, and you set an example for all who follow. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Can I call on Ken Semler to come up and give us a little bit of the story of 639? Thanks, Ken.
Thanks very much indeed, and distinguished guests, illustrious members of the War Memorial staff, fellow FACs. It's been a real privilege over recent years to share with Matt Anderson. And one of the stories we shared, probably about 12, 18 months ago, Matt had been asked to conduct a tour here for a gent who'd flown the Chinook and his family. In that family was a very bright young lad, and at the end of the tour, Matt reported that this young gent was asked, "Oh, by the way, look, what was your favourite aeroplane?" "The OV-10. Now, really, how come such a young lad delivered such a discerning, wise answer? Good question. And we will chase through very briefly today a little bit of the background of the forward air controller, how it came to be here, and some closing comments. We can probably start once upon a time, a long, long time ago. As with all conflicts, you say, what's the flaming opposition up to over the other side of the hill? Come civil war, simple answer. Suspend a bloke under a balloon and send the balloon aloft. Okay, that practice or malpractice continued through World War I. Not good for the long life or good health of the bod suspended under said balloon, but nevertheless, we moved through to World War II, where communications and the aircraft technology had greatly improved. From there, we went through to Korea, and of course, there the role of the FAC started to gel through the Malayan campaign, and of course, to Vietnam. All right, great stuff. And today, we have 4th Squadron, the 8th Squadron that served as a FAC during World War II, up through the New Guinea and the islands. They're still doing the job, this time under the PC-21. Great stuff. Now, the role of the FAC in Vietnam. Very important, because to be linked closely to a specific Army unit, conduct visual reconnaissance, control of artillery, and naval gunfire. Amazing stuff too. And above all, to become the tactical commander, as has already been mentioned, marking targets the FACs call hit my smoke. Gunship support, medevac, whatever. So we saw a lieutenant or a flying officer become the tactical commander during a fight. And maybe that's why we never lost a fight. Just a thought. To Vietnam. RAF involvement began in '66 with Wing Commander Vance Drummond. He served in the Tactical Air Control Centre of what was to become the US 7th Air Force. However, halfway through his tour, he escaped from the TAC and took on the role of an 01 FAC for the remainder of his tour. And this laid the foundation for 36 of us from the fighter world to do likewise, serving on the 01, the 02, and the OV-10. And our Kiwi friends also joined the team, with 14 of them serving as FACs. And early in the 60s, the need for a counterinsurgency aircraft that could work closely with the Army became quite obvious. And a couple of Marine majors who'd served as FACs in Korea, Majors Beckett and Rice, got to designing an aircraft. Somehow the rest of the services were encouraged to get interested, and behold, a contract was ultimately offered to North American Aviation. Amazingly enough, from the contract signing to the first flight of the prototype, 9 months. That's not a bad effort, not a bad effort at all. And then in August of '68, saw the OV-10 start flying ops with the USAF out of Benoit. Now the Marines had beat the USAF to the gun by a couple of months. Well, all credit to the Marines. Ken Mitchell, stick your hand up, where are you? There he is. He was on the first OV-10 in-country conversion course, a foreigner with the USAF flying OV-10s, great stuff. And subsequently, 20 of us did all or part of our tour on the beloved OV-10. But let's visit just a couple of OV-10 sorties. Tom Kemp, where are you? Ah, there he is, great stuff. Oh, by the way, he's a young fella. Yesterday he celebrated his 80th birthday. Happy birthday, Tom. But let's go backwards to the 18th of March, 1972. An OV-10 with 2 blokes on board was shot down. And Tom, as Nail 17, was on site and played a very major role in keeping the NVA at bay and the 2 blokes rescued. What aircraft was he flying? 639. A couple of months later, now some of you may have read the book, The Rescue of Bat 21. It was probably the major and fiercest rescue operation in the Vietnam War. A certain aeroplane, over 2 days, logged over 14 hours in that fight. 639. It's a miracle the flaming thing survived, but it did. And we also have with us today from the States, Roger Dodd, stick your hand up, Dick Green, Bob Miller. Ah, fantastic. All blokes with hours in the beloved 639. And subsequently, this aircraft served in South Korea, Germany, and of course the States, but before being transferred to the Philippine Air Force, where counterinsurgency ops were flown until its last flight, 13th of October, 93. Captain Sylvester Glenoga, stick your mitt up. Great. He's also flown 639. But it's worth spending a minute and telling a story about this bloke. His nickname's Big Mac. Why? Because during school he worked at McDonald's. Why? To get cash to get flying lessons. What a noble endeavour. But he got smart. He said, forget about that, I'm going to join the Air Force and they'll teach me to fly. And that's what happened. Big Mac, great stuff. And as Matt mentioned, Major General Steve Gower, during his time as director, oversaw the start of getting a shopping list. Coupled with that was the start of the OV-10 Bronco Association in Fort Worth. What a great mob. Jim Hodgson, stick your hand up. Marine Fact, great stuff. And have you already met Tom? And they have a historian, Chuck Burren. Now, it's a pity Chuck can't be here today. As I've shared with some of you, at long last, he actually obeyed a command, being a Marine. And the command came from the medicos, and the command was, thou shalt not commit aviation and fly to Australia, because you mightn't get there alive. Sadly, he's not here, but he's the bloke who made the connections to find the aircraft via Big Mac, that here it was in the used aircraft yard of the Philippine Air Force. The interesting thing being, in that top 10 shopping list, 5 of those were combat casualties, 2 were rubbed out in prangs, 1 in the Philippines, and, in South Korea. And so we were left with number 4 on the list, 639. And really, it's a tribute to all those blokes I mentioned that we've got it. Indeed, it's a pity Chuck can't be here today because he did a lot of groundwork in developing the capabilities of the OV-10 in Vietnam. But okay, we fast forward to June 2001. A photograph turned up from Big Mac, Doug Riding, who was also on the Air Marshal Doug Riding on the War Memorial Council, and Air Vice Marshal Graham Neal, who's unable to be here today. And that, there's nothing like photographic evidence. It convinced the council that, hey, this is what we're after. Yes, it is possible to restore this aircraft. So, with the able help, above and beyond the call of duty of Colonel Chris Burns, our military attaché at the time, on the 21st of February 2005, there was a parade at which 639 was handed over to Air Marshal Angus Houston. Long story short, 4 attempts were made by the Royal Australian Navy to bring the aircraft back here to Oz. And it's just amazing that today we've got the now Rear Admiral Wolski, who was Captain HMAS Tobruk, on the 4th attempt, and they brought the bird back to its residence here. And that just illustrates the persistence of the Royal Australian Navy, to which we're very much indebted. Incidentally, most of you would have received a copy of this. There's a lot more detailed information in there. And if you ever want to look up something for lack of something better to read, Graham Neal wrote a very good burst called A Steed Reborn. Just consult Mr. Google. But it wasn't full steam ahead because of the usual thing, budget restrictions. Oh dear, what's new? Nothing. Anyway, as a volunteer, gopher, yours truly did a few trips to the States, and it was decreed that during previous director, Dr. Brendan Nelson's tenure, a generous donation was made to the War Memorial by Dick Smith, and it was decreed that those funds would go to help the restoration of this aeroplane. And during 17, Laura Kennedy, who's already been mentioned, and Woody, did a run to lay the foundation for getting our sticky fingers on parts that were becoming more scarce. And it's worth recounting a little story during the 100th anniversary of RAF Point Cook as a flying training base. I happened to be yarning with Frank Fry. Frank, where are you? Yep, OV-10 FAC. And a bloke by the name of Norm Earl in Florida. He had an aircraft business, including OV-10 bits and pieces. And he'd sold his business and had just vanished off the radar. Even Chuck Burren couldn't find him. Anyway, he's yarning to Frank. Of course, we're talking about the OV-10. And I mentioned Norm Earl, and I'll never forget Frank's reply. Oh, I bought an aircraft from him. My reply, you what? Out of that came a phone number, a call, a bloke answering it, Norm Earl speaking. And that was really great. He was in North Carolina contemplating planting a vineyard. Imagine. So we had common ground, quite apart from the OV-10. So off we went then to the Bronco Fest, a must visit, to extract bits from Jim Hodson, thank you Jim, and then a hilarious couple of days in Florida, scratching around on the floor of Norm Earl's shed and just about filling Woody's shopping list. And no doubt we'll hear about that from Woody. And by the way, just a little story. Going back quite a while, I contemplated how this illustrious event should be run. I suggested that with a system of pulleys and a cable, Woody, with angel's wings and steel-cap boots, should descend down that cable. As he came over the aircraft, a container of ribbons would be dropped and Woody would just disappear out of the door. The reply was, I don't think Oc Health and Safety would approve that. What a shame how adventure and fun is often frowned upon. However, and it's a big however, and I misquote that most eminent statesman, Sir Winston Churchill, in saying, in reference to this thankful gathering, this is merely the end of the beginning. Why should that be said? Each item, a painting, or what might initially seem just a hunk of scrap metal in the War Memorial collection, tells a story, and that's already been mentioned. And isn't that what the War Memorial is about? 639 doesn't just stand alone as an item of curiosity. No, it tells a story, sure, of the close relationship between the States and Oz, but much more than that. It can be the focal point in telling the story of joint operations, be that in an O1, O2, OV-10, or hanging underneath a balloon. So the next step is to prepare the educational display. And really, on behalf of all, a special thank you to the War Memorial for the restoration and honouring us today. This afternoon, we go from here to the last post ceremony, and there'll be a wreath laid. On it will be a card like this. I'll quote briefly from it. Former USAF and Marine facts have come to Australia to be with us on this occasion. The wreath is laid by Air Marshal Doug Riding, AO DFC, accompanied by US Marine Corps and United States Air Force facts, to honour all who served and the 288 facts who were killed in action in Vietnam. Thanks for the privilege of sharing with you, and let's not forget that this is merely the end of the beginning.
Ken, on behalf of everybody, thanks very much for that tremendous oration. So my duty now is not to introduce the Archangel Gabriel delivered to you by a system of pulleys and wires, but our senior aircraft conservator, the Reverend King Wood.
Good afternoon, distinguished all. It's great to have you here. And it's great to have an opportunity to have a bit of a yak as to how we got to here. What was the nuts and bolts? What did they look like? Well, they were plenty. And before I moved on, although they've been acknowledged, I want to acknowledge my team, the team that helped me to do this job. I couldn't do it alone. I needed others. So I want to publicly just acknowledge Jamie, Mark, Bridie. We had some volunteers, Nick Nolan, and Brian Ewens, as well as Ainsley Greiner and Dean Willis, are all guys within our workshop that helped. They've all had their hands on this aeroplane, and I think each and every one of them have paid the price in blood, because that's what we're dealing with. It's a little bleeder. I started the War Memorial some 12 years ago, and I walked into the collection area, and I looked at this green little monster sitting in the corner, and I thought to myself, who's the poor sap that's got to fix that pile of rubbish up? And I paraphrased, because what I actually thought was very workshop orientated. But I looked at it and it became a bit curious. I knew what an OV-10 was. I didn't know how it was made or what was inside it or anything like that. It was a bit of a curiosity, and I was interested in it and things like that. And lo and behold, after we finished the Hudson, one of the things on the chalkboard was, Woody, we need you to do the work on the OV-10. Ripper, great. And Tim Sullivan sent me a brief of all the correspondence that had been created over the OV-10 639. And I was overwhelmed by the amount of information. It was going to take me months, years, to go through all the literature that was there. But what I got straight from it was the passion that was involved in this aeroplane. And we're here to tell the story of Australian service. I'm an ex-Australian serviceman, so that means something to me. Esprit de corps means something to me. So I wanted to be able to tell this story for those fellas that had served. They happened to be the officers and pilots that I had strapped in when I was a young 17-year-old and had joined the Royal Australian Air Force myself. So it felt like a circle. It felt like we were coming back. But I've been asked to talk about how. Well, one of the first things that I was asked to do was create a schedule, Woody. Create a schedule. Tell me how you're going to do it. And tell me how long it's going to take. And the first thing I had to work out was how many boxes I was going to create. How many components I was going to break this aeroplane down into. Because every one of those boxes had to be opened. And every one of them were mysteries inside. The hardest question I've been asked in the whole process of restoring this aeroplane is, Woody, how long? What do you need? Where's it going to go? I don't know. I haven't looked in the box. And the box, trust me, was full of trinkets. There were rats' nests. There was grass. There was bits of parachute in there. The rats had been busy. And it was full of corrosion. It was a little wreck. For those of you that know anything about corrosion, aluminium corrodes. Aluminium alloys corrode even worse. They're already in conflict with one another. You add a little bit of moisture and a little bit of acid and a bit of oxygen, and you've got yourself an Alka-Seltzer. This was an aviation Alka-Seltzer, and we had to rein that in. Now, the best thing that happened is we got the thing inside, and we took it out of the moist environment. From there, we opened it up and we cleaned all the rubbish out of it and cleaned the dirt out of it. And we polished and we scrubbed and we brushed and we washed again and we cleaned. And then it came to the paint. Oh my goodness, the paint. I don't know what this thing had been painted in, but some paint engineer, scientist, boffin person had created a mixture that was on another level. I employed one of the best paint strippers in the industry, a thing called Yellow Peril. Its name suits it. It's one of those products that when it lands on your skin, you know it's on your skin. And it would only soften it a little. So you'd apply more and more and more. And finally, with persistence, we managed to grind our way through it. Got that all finished up, got it all nice and clean, had done a bit of work, and all you guys came for a bit of a visit to have a bit of a look at a fuselage. That was merely the beginning. Then it came, and now you knew the wing was going to be a big problem. Because you see, this aeroplane is not like your normal aeroplane. For those of you that built model aeroplanes as a kid, and you started with a little piece of cockpit and put a fuselage around it and then stuck some wings to it and put a tail on it. That's not how this thing's built. You start with a wing and you hang everything off it. So the perspective is totally different. And the wing had to be viable. The wing had to be strong enough to be able to support the sum of all the parts that we were going to hang off it. And it just wasn't so. That's not to say it couldn't have been repaired, but it would have taken a lot of money and it would have taken a lot of time, and the way it's constructed, it would have had to totally come to pieces. For you see, along the top of the wing of this, it's constructed a bit like a cardboard box. There's a skin with some corrugated aluminium with another skin underneath it, and that's a great thing for you to walk around on and be able to service the top of the aeroplane. But when you store the wing in a moist environment upside down, you just create this new environment of chaos. And the wing, all the extrusions, all the items had just puffed up like phyllo pastry. And so every attachment point for all the control surfaces had all fried up, and they were just no good. The entire top of the wing had totally exfoliated. The caps around the top of the wing had puffed up to a point, and that was the beginning of the story. Trying to get in there and actually salvage, cannibalise parts out of that wing to use in this was quite a task in itself, as it was for the rest of the aeroplane, because I had to break open these boxes that I'm talking about, and that meant all the screws and the fasteners. And we just look at, you just walk up to it with a screwdriver and unwind the screw. Not when they've been in this condition for that long. Every single screw and every single fastener required its own little strategy. And of course, it's not a normal fastener. All the hardware on this aeroplane comes out of the special premium hardware category. They took it from the aerospace hardware line instead of the aircraft hardware line. So that meant shopping for nuts and bolts and screws and fasteners had to come from the military sources and things like that. Attention to detail, one of those things, the aeroplane is covered in a fastener called a high torque. It doesn't really quite look like a Phillips screwdriver tip. We could buy those. Those screws are like 6 cents a pop. But to go and buy a high torque fastener, you start at $6 a pop. And when I need thousands and thousands and thousands, I just didn't have the emotional energy to take that request up the line to a point where we might have got somewhere. I had to get this project finished. So we had to do things that, this is not a flying aeroplane. We had to make compromises. There are little sneaky things about this hardware basket that are a little bit different in the sense that even the thread form is not a standard thread form. I don't want to use all technical acronyms and things like that, but it uses a lot of UNF, Unified National Fine Fasteners. But no, these aren't Unified National Fine, they're Unified National Fine J. What's J? Now they've got to modify it a little bit just to make it a little bit stronger. So they changed the radius on the top of the thread and the bottom of the thread, which means that if you try and wind an aircraft standard fastener into a J thread, it binds up and galls and snaps off. So you got to, every step of the way there were little obstacles. Every step of the way, this was like eating an elephant, and you just had to go one mouthful at a time. So you break it down and you adjust the schedule again and again and again, to the frustration of those that were trying to look after the schedule. In the end of the day, I was just a guy with a bunch of sticks and a heap of plates, and I was just trying to keep them all spinning. And luckily I had a team to help me to do that. So there it was. So we've talked about fasteners, we've talked about rat's nest, we've talked about all those sorts of things. Then it came time we had to put it together. Well, it's not too bad, it's a relatively thing. We suspend a wing in midair and then we support all the bits and pieces underneath it. No, not really. You put the wing on a set of jacks and you start putting bits and pieces. And luckily here at the War Memorial, we have one of the best examples of a jack collection that I've ever seen. Andy, that's something for you. We just have this amazing, and it enabled me, in order to be able to suspend this thing and sort it out. We've got a big crane in the workshop, so I had the facilities, I had the muscle to be able to move things around and get them into place. And so we started that journey of reassembling the major bits and pieces. I had to keep in mind how the heck I was going to get it out the door. It's fine to put it all together, but then do I want to go to the nth degree and have to disassemble the whole thing to get it out the door? And how am I going to move it around? Do I have to make stands? So I thought, no, well, there must be a way of breaking this thing down small enough so that we can get it in and out of the door. And the way we did that was I found a field brake in the middle of the booms, the two tail booms on the back, and I could oh my goodness, when I got in there to try and undo those fasteners, they were well and truly stuck. That was an effort in contortionary to get in there and undo those, but we did it, we found it, we achieved it, and we overcame that. Now there's the story of attention to detail. With all this information and correspondence that I've been given, I was given a fantastic gallery of images and photographs by which we could put together a picture of what this aeroplane was supposed to look like. One of the key things that happened early in the piece was I was given a magic day, the 13th of July, 1970, and there was an image of the aeroplane. Now what did that do? That stopped all the folklore arguments as to what something should look like. It gave me a point in time of which I could work toward. That meant that I could look at photos around that period of time and judge what we were going to do and how we were going to put this thing together so that it represented how that aeroplane was on that particular day. Right down to the point of detail where I went through the logbooks and I found the serial numbers of the propellers. And I used the serial numbers from that logbook to put the numbers that are just a little token that a lot of people just see the noise of information on the blade of the propeller, but they mean something. And every blade corresponds to each other in a set as they would during the time. The correction angles all meant something, and so they were all put on there as they should be. When we did the hydraulic system up inside the nose, we went to the trouble of actually finding the decals and putting the original manufacturer decals on all the tubing so that they were identified for being what hydraulic system they're in, whether it be pitot tubes or a little chrome looking fancy stickers that go on things. The part numbers for all the pipes, we put all that detail back into it. The style of hardware that was up inside there. The switch gear. There are examples where we didn't have some of the components inside the cockpit. So I had to drill down through the parts and find out who had made the part, and from there find a like example that operated in the right way and drill down and find a part number. And then off another aeroplane, I found, for instance, on the top of the instrument combing, there's the arm panel. One of those lights is a pull to a rocker type switch, a bit of an interesting sort of switch. Well, I found one of those on a Beechcraft. And so because that was still a flying aeroplane that I could relate to, and it wasn't a military aeroplane, I could drill down through there and buy a generic switch that would serve the purpose. So that attention to detail it was important. The twin contact tyre. We managed to find a twin contact original tyre for this aeroplane. You can't just go and buy one off the shelf. The colours on the spinner. We had to drill down through and find colours and match colours and get everything to work. And through all these hundreds of photos, you get a little glimpse of the edge of a bit of the decaling around the side of the fuselage to build the picture that represents now what this is. I feel quite proud to be able to stand up here today and with my hand on my heart and say, this is the best we could do with the resources that I have. Because I wanted to be able to tell the story of Australian service. I wanted to be able to convey that message. And I hope that one day, everybody's story is told that has served. There's so much more I can say. We could go on for hours, but it'll end up in technical white noise. And I don't think nobody's fallen asleep yet. I'm just having a quick look around, and I'm a big one for quitting while I'm ahead. But I just want to thank you all. I thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to ply my trade. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kim, for those terrific sort of story of the conservation of this aeroplane. And I must admit, it sort of brought back to me your briefing on the corrosion of aluminium pitched for a slightly dim-witted ex-infantry officer. As many people in this room will know, that project management is about trying to achieve objectives, and we did manage this aeroplane as one of the first projects that the memorial's done in the time since I've been here, and Kim and the other guys in the workshop put up with the where's the schedule, when are we going to have this finished, don't tell me about known unknowns or unknown unknowns, when do we get to the end of it. And it is the great credit of the staff of the memorial and Kim's team that they produced this aeroplane, which will now be part of the memorial's collection forever.